मुकाबला न करो, ऐसे चेहरों का सामना न करो, ऐसे चेहरों का सामना न करो। रेजा रेजा पहाड़ हो जाए, एक इशारा जो इनका पाते हैं। जश्न ज़हरा का जब मनाते हैं, अर्श वाले भी सुनने आते हैं। जश्न ज़हरा का जब मनाते हैं, अर्श वाले भी सुनने आते हैं। पहले को अजब शान से चले हैं रसूल, फलक से आके मलक चूमते हैं पाँव की धूल। नबी के साथ अली और फातिमा के हैं फूल, और उनके पीछे है खातून कायनात बुतूल। अली है मर गए, अली है मर गए कौनों मकान के पीछे। खुदा का हाथ है इस कारवान के पीछे। सुने सुने ये सारा ज़माना मुबाहिला क्या है।
अऊज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम। बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम। अन जाबिर इब्न अब्दिल्लाह अल-अंसारी अन फातिमा ज़हरा अलैहिस्सलाम बिन्त रसूलिल्लाह सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि व आलिहि वसल्लम क़ाल समिअतु फ़ातिमा अन्नहा क़ालत दख़ल अलय्य अबी रसूलुल्लाह फ़ी बअज़िल अय्याम फ़क़ाल अस्सलामु अलैकि या फ़ातिमा फ़क़ुल्तु अलैका अस्सलाम क़ाल इन्नी अजिदु फ़ी बदनी ضعफा فقلت له أعيذك بالله يا أبتاه من الضعف فقال يا فاطمة ائتيني بالكساء اليماني فغطيني به فأتيته بالكساء اليماني فغطيته به وصرت أنظر إليه وإذا وجهه يتلألأ كأنه البدر في ليلة تمامه وكماله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وأجل فرجهم. فما كانت إلا ساعة وإذا بولدي الحسن قد أقبل وقال السلام عليك يا أمه فقلت وعليك السلام يا قرة عيني وثمرة فؤادي فقال يا أماه إني أشم عندك رائحة طيبة كأنها رائحة جدي رسول الله فقلت نعم إن جدك تحت الكساء فأقبل الحسن نحو الكساء وقال السلام عليك يا جداه يا رسول الله أتأذن لي أن أدخل معك تحت الكساء فقال وعليك السلام يا ولدي ويا صاحب حوضي قد أذنت لك فدخل معه تحت الكساء فما كانت إلا ساعة وإذا بولدي الحسين قد أقبل وقال السلام عليك يا أمه فقلت وعليك السلام يا ولدي ويا قرة عيني وثمرة فؤادي قال لي يا أماه إني أشم عندك رائحة طيبة كأنها رائحة جدي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله. فقلت نعم إن جدك وأخاك تحت الكساء. فدنا الحسين نحو الكساء وقال السلام عليك يا جداه، السلام عليك يا من اختاره الله، فتأذن لي أن أكون معكما تحت الكساء. فقال وعليك السلام يا ولدي ويا شافع أمتي، قد أذنت لك. فدخل معهما تحت الكساء. فأقبل عند ذلك أبو الحسن علي بن أبي طالب وقال السلام عليك يا بنت رسول الله. فقلت وعليك السلام يا أبا الحسن ويا أمير المؤمنين. فقال يا فاطمة إني أشم عندك رائحة طيبة كأنها رائحة أخي وابن عمي رسول الله. فقلت نعم ها هو مع ولديك تحت الكساء. فأقبل علي نحو الكساء فقال السلام عليك يا رسول الله، فتأذن لي أن أكون معكم تحت الكساء. قال له وعليك السلام يا أخي يا وصي وخليفتي وصاحب لوائي، قد أذنت لك. فدخل علي تحت الكساء ثم أتيت نحو الكساء وقلت السلام عليك يا أبتاه يا رسول الله، أتأذن لي أن أكون معكم تحت الكساء. وقال وعليك السلام يا بنتي ويا بضعتي، قد أذنت لك. فدخلت تحت الكساء. فلما اكتملنا جميعا تحت الكساء أخذ أبي رسول الله بطرف الكساء وأومأ بيده اليمنى إلى السماء وقال اللهم إن هؤلاء أهل بيتي وخاصتي وحامتي، لحمهم لحمي ودمهم دمي، يؤلمني ما يؤلمهم ويحزنني ما يحزنهم. أنا حرب لمن حاربهم وسلم لمن سالمهم وعدو لمن عاداهم ومحب لمن أحبهم. إنهم مني وأنا منهم، فاجعل صلواتك وبركاتك ورحمتك وغفرانك ورضوانك علي وعليهم، وأذهب عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وأجل فرجهم. قال الله عز وجل يا ملائكتي ويا سكان سماواتي إني ما خلقت سماء مبنيا ولا أرضا مدحيا ولا قمرا منيرا ولا شمسا مضيئا ولا فلكا يدور ولا بحرا يجري ولا فلكا يسري إلا في محبة هؤلاء الخمسة الذين هم تحت الكساء. وقال الأمين جبرائيل يا ربي ومن تحت الكساء؟ وقال عز وجل هم أهل بيت النبوة ومعدن الرسالة، هم فاطمة وأبوها وبعلها وبنوها. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وأجل فرجهم. فقال جبرائيل يا ربي أتأذن لي أن أهبط إلى الأرض لأكون معهم سادسا؟ فقال الله نعم قد أذنت لك. فهبط الأمين جبرائيل وقال السلام عليك يا رسول الله. العلي الأعلى يقرأك السلام ويخصك بالتحية والإكرام ويقول لك وعزتي وجلالي إني ما خلقت سماء مبنيا ولا أرضا مدحيا ولا قمرا منيرا ولا شمسا مضيئا ولا فلكا يدور ولا بحرا يجري ولا فلكا يسري إلا لأجلكم ومحبتكم وقد أذن لي أن أدخل معكم فهل تأذن لي يا رسول الله؟ قال رسول الله وعليك السلام يا أمين وحي الله إنه ونعم قد أذنت لك. فدخل جبرائيل معنا تحت الكساء فقال لأبي إن الله قد أوحى إليكم يقول إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وأجل فرجهم. فقال علي لأبي يا رسول الله أخبرني ما لجلوسنا هذا تحت الكساء من الفضل عند الله. فقال النبي والذي بعثني بالحق نبيا واصطفاني بالرسالة نجيا ما ذكر خبرنا هذا في محفل من محافل أهل الأرض وفيه جمع من شيعتنا ومحبينا إلا ونزلت عليهم الرحمة وحفت بهم الملائكة واستغفرت لهم إلى أن يتفرقوا. فقال علي إذا والله فزنا ففاز شيعتنا ورب الكعبة. قال النبي ثانيا يا علي والذي بعثني بالحق نبيا واصطفاني بالرسالة نجيا ما ذكر خبرنا هذا في محفل من محافل أهل الأرض وفيه جمع من شيعتنا ومحبينا وفيهم مهموم إلا وفرج الله همه ولا مغموم إلا وكشف الله غمه ولا طالب حاجة إلا وقضى الله حاجته. وقال علي إذا والله فزنا وسعدنا وكذلك شيعتنا فازوا وسعدوا في الدنيا والآخرة ورب الكعبة. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم كل وليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلة برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. سورة المباركة الفاتحة قبل الصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Sayyidina wa Maulana Abil Qasimi Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa atil farajahum. وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين قضى الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. Firstly, congratulations to all of you, all the believers, on this day of Eid that we're celebrating together, which in fact is really the final Eid now before the coming of Muharram. These last 2 weeks have been quite important. I would say the last 15 days in total are extremely important, in particular for the followers of Ahlul Bayt. And the reason being is that many things have happened in the last 15 days. From the time of Eid al-Adha to the time of Ghadir, to the time of Mubahila. Within that, you could say a number of things have taken place. I'd say the first most important thing after Eid al-Adha that's taken place is the revelation of the Wilaya. Innama waliyakum Allahu Rasuluh. This was actually revealed in the first 15 days. These 15 days that we're going through at the moment. In the same way, the entire tradition of Ghadir, the verse of the Quran, Al-Yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum, was again revealed in these 15 days. Hadith Kisa was revealed in these 15 days. In fact, there's a tradition to say that Amir al-Mu'mineen became Amir al-Mu'mineen in these 15 days. The title of the Imam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, was given to him in these 15 days. Ayat Tathir was revealed in these 15 days. So really, these 15 days are the pinnacle of the entire year when it comes to the Fadail of Ahlul Bayt. I could go on, but I'm going to give you a hadith actually just to emphasize. Hadith goes like this, that Ibn Abbas one day was walking with the Prophet. And as they left their house and they were walking, there was a narrow alleyway, you could say. And as they came into this alleyway, right in front was Amir al-Mu'mineen. At that time was Ali ibn Abi Talib only. And Imam looks up and he says, Assalamu alayka ya Rasulullah. And the reply comes from the Prophet, Wa alayka assalam ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. And at that moment, Ibn Abbas takes a step back. Now put yourself in the position of Ibn Abbas for a minute. Who are you calling? All of a sudden, the Prophet of God, the best in creation, the final Prophet, the best of all of the Anbiya, Sayyid al-Anbiya, and he's called somebody else, Amir al-Mu'mineen. So they say that Ibn Abbas is startled. He asked the question, he says, Ya Rasulullah, is this the love that you have for the Imam that you call him like this, or is it the fact that Allah has decreed it? Now look, one of the most important things here to bear in mind is this. Immediately Sunni Shia tradition record this. Was it out of love for Imam Ali, or is it because of the fact that Allah decreed it? Whether you believe or you don't believe, the bottom line is that the Sahaba understood the intense love Rasulullah had for Amir al-Mu'mineen. You don't need to go any further in this tradition to know that Rasulullah had intense love for the Imam. And that love was unmatched for anybody else. And if Ibn Abbas is to say that, are you calling him Amir al-Mu'mineen out of love? It means the fact that there was no one more beloved to the Prophet in all of Islam than Amir al-Mu'mineen. Why? Because you don't find this kind of language for anybody else. And when you find such a language, when you're calling somebody Amir al-Mu'mineen, right? It has value to it. Why is that? Here's the Prophet. The Quran says, وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. And here he's calling Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen. Now look, most of us may not be familiar with the Arabic language. It may not be our first language. Zamir al-Samir al-Mu'mineen, people will translate it as Prince of the Believers. That's a wrong translation. It's a horrendously poor translation. Somebody else may turn around and call him Commander of the Faithful. Again, in essence, it's a poor translation. Put everything to one side. Ask yourself the question, what does Amir mean? Amir means king, leader, a person of authority. The problem is that in the 21st century, we, at least many Shias, have a problem with the concept of king. The previous people didn't do because there was no democratic system in the olden days. You may notice that the system which was running was a kingship system. And it's not unknown for religions to have kings. Now here, I'm not advocating the concept of sovereignty here of a king or a queen. But the reason why this is important is because the vast majority of Muslims just don't understand what the philosophy of Amir is. Leader. And when you look at Sahih Muslim or Sahih Bukhari, and there the hadith mentions that after me there will be 12 umara, 12 amirs. There's a great depth in this language. Look, if I call Imam Ali king, you'll look at me and think, what is he talking about? If I say king and there's a Christian or a Jew sitting there, they'll understand what the concept of Amir al-Mu'mineen means better than the vast majority of Muslims today. The reason being is this. The Quran, with 6,600 odd verses, 900 to 1,000 verses, is directly talking to Bani Israel. There many a time where the Quran mentions something and you think to yourself, why is Allah mentioning this? Problem is, though, that we as a community are not well versed in the scriptures of those religions, Abrahamic faith, which have gone. In fact, we need to be well versed because much of the Quran, 1/6 of it deals specifically with Bani Israel. And if we are only relying on certain traditions to be able to interpret it, it becomes difficult. Why? Well, we all know that the vast majority of Shia text which once existed was burnt down, either in the Sunni Shia schism that takes place 1,000 years ago. Not saying that the material we have is not enough. No, it's enough for our mujtahideen to be able to extract fatwa, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's sufficient enough to be able to cover everything. Had it been sufficient enough, the Imams would not have dictated all of these things that were then burned down in the libraries of Kufa, the libraries of Baghdad. And these books being wasted by being chucked away into the river, and they say the Furat for days ran black. In effect, whether it was days or an hour or a minute, the fact of the matter was there was a lot of ink, a lot of destruction that takes place. 1/6 of your tradition deals with Bani Israel, then it's important to understand and cross-reference again. For those people who don't know, Christianity and Judaism both have the concept of kings, right? They have two channels. They have prophecy and they have kingship. That kingship is mansus min Allah, from Allah. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a prophet is a king, right? I'll give you an example. Many prophets of the Bani Israel were not kings. But there were kings and there were prophets living side by side. One king which unites both prophecy and kingship is Dawood. And this is what you find in a tradition that says that on the Day of Judgment, when this idea of this Amir or the Wali is called upon, they say Dawood is going to come forward. And at that point, where he's going to come, Allah is going to say, this is not your time. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen is going to come forward. Why? Because Dawood really is the first king, infallible king amongst the Jews. Solomon, for example, was a king. And the whole understanding of Jesus, right? Call it the Masih. In English is known as the Messiah, in Hebrew is known as the Mashiach. Who's the Mashiach? The Mashiach was a king. And that's why they labeled him, whether derogatory or otherwise. you find this term, the king of the Jews, right? And in all these passion plays, and you can go on television and all of those films around Easter, when they're going to kill him, in terms of a derogatory reference, you'll find that at the time the Romans were to call him the king of the Jews, for example. So there is a concept of kingship there. Now, we Muslims may not understand this, unless, of course, you live in an Arab country that has kingship, and you'd call your kings Emir. But the reality is that when the 12th Imam does come, alayhi salam, much of this philosophy is going to be carbon copied, you could say, parallel. So when Christians and Jews do come to the Imam, they'll understand the concept because it runs within their principles. We had Khalifas, let's say, there were kingships and so forth. But here, if you look at even some of the traditions of the Prophet, he calls Imam Ali the king of the Arabs. Right? So there's a statement here that's being made. And the 12 Imams, and this is why I guess in some North Indian cultures, you have the concept of Shah. You know, Shah Hussain, Shahzada Ali Akbar. Why are you calling him Shahzada Ali Akbar, Shahzadi? Because these are concepts that go back to dominance. They're not wrong what they're saying. If Amir al-Mu'minin is Amir al-Mu'minin, that there is no dominance on this. And you see some of the Nohi who say Shah, use the term Shah. Shah means king, Amir. Imam Hussain is, nobody would deny that. If you call Imam Hussain a king, you wouldn't deny it. The only reason that at least now within Iran, if you go back pre-revolution, the Imamzades would be called Shahzadeh. And the only reason that was removed because of the confusion it was having with the Shah. But the king of kings is the Imam, Amir al-Mu'minin. The only reason I mention this is just for your own understanding that there's always a different dimension to what our understanding is. Remember this. There will be a time when the whole world comes to the Imam. You have to understand from their point of view and their perspective, what these alqab can mean. So even within Christianity, by the way, let me just complete this conversation that we're having, and then we can move on. In terms of Christianity, all the way up to maybe 600 years ago, you had what is known as the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor was in parallel to the Pope. So there was always two stations, you could say, and they were always not feuding, at least internally. So the Holy Roman Emperor, the final of which you could say was Charles V. For those people who have been to Spain, in south of Spain, you have a place called Andalusia. Andalus, right? You go to Andalus. Over there, you go to Malaga. For example, from Malaga, you drive in maybe 2 hours or so. You come into this palace of Charles V, which actually was built by Muslims because these were Umayya palaces. Now, when I say Umayya, not the Umayyas, which were at the time in the Arab world. But if you remember your history, when the Abbasis came into power, a group of Umayyads broke off and they built a sultanate, a caliphate within south of Spain. Right? And this is that south of Spain where later on in Andalusia, you find that they became quite intellectual. There was an entire school over there. You'll see it as well. Some of the great scholars with the term Andalus or Andalusi after their names. They were mostly Zahiri in their maktab. Some of them are Malikis. There was a group who may have been Nasibi, but there was also a Shia stronghold there, which the vast majority of people don't know about, including the vast majority of scholars, because obviously history is not really something which is always discussed. But within that particular part of Spain, there was a place called Madinat al-Zahra, and that was a Shia stronghold, in fact. So, the argument, for example, that this is again an intellectual argument, was Ibn Arabi influenced by Shias at the beginning? And there is an argument to say that yes, he was, because for astrology, he would go to certain astrologers who lived in Madinat al-Zahra. Anyhow, I digress. I'm moving away, but it tells you the interlinkage that different schools of thought have, how knowledge is refined. As you know, outwardly Ibn Arabi is a Sunni, the most famous mystic in Sunni Islam, the most famous in terms of Irfan al-Nadhari. And if you're going to study a book, it's going to be Ibn Arabi's book, Irfan al-Nadhari. whereas there's an ikhtilaf between Shia and Sunni is maktab. Obviously, if you read his stuff, there's no way that he's of the same understanding as the modern day Sunni. Any modern day Sunni who would look at the works of Ibn Arabi only and only in terms of Insan Kamil and Imam itself, if you remove the name of Ibn Arabi and just show them the text, they would definitely say that this is by Shi'i. Right? We put the name of Ibn Arabi, everybody wants to claim him. But the fact that he talks about Imam Ali and the Prophet being the most superior and Imam Ali being Sir al-Anbiya and so forth, multiple traditions. And I'm not going to go deeper into it. My book is being published on this particular topic, so later on maybe you can read it. There's 252 pages. But yeah, the fact of the matter really is this. When you consolidate everything, bring it together, is that one has to understand from a different perspective as well what these terminologies mean. Now look, my topic wasn't at all in relation to Amir al-Mu'mineen, and I've just knocked off 20 minutes just on that. But I'm going to bring it back again, that here the Prophet of God, to complete this, says that Jibreel has come to me, where he has come, and he's told me to call Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen. Now look, we have a tradition, at least in Shia Islam, from the 6th Imam alayhi salam, that says anyone else who claims to have this laqab, because when people asked him, I said, why don't you use this term Amir al-Mu'mineen? And in fact, he argued this point and he said, look, if anybody uses this term, it's a sign of their kufr, basically. This is only for the Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen. And you can always say, what about the Imams themselves using this title for certain Khalifas? Well, again, that was Zaman al-Taqiyya, right? If somebody's forcing you, if your life and your respect and your honor and dignity are in danger, a word's not going to make a difference. But in essence, if you have the free will, there's only one Amir, and that's the Imam alayhi salam. So some of these terminologies you'll find are more linked to the Abrahamic faiths. As a Jew, as a Christian, they would understand it better than we would do. And the point of me mentioning this is to give you a different perspective, because we are discussing Mubahila. We are going to be discussing Christianity. We are going to be discussing in this 14, 15 days the Ahlul Bayt, who are the Waratha, the Warith of the Anbiya, and the vast majority of known Anbiya were all from Bani Israel. If you look at the line of Ismail, how many prophets are you aware of, other than maybe Sa'd and Saleh and Hud? How many prophets are you aware of who are from the line of Ismail? Whereas if you look at the Quran, the vast majority of prophets mentioned in the Quran, bar 2 probably, or 3, come back to Bani Israel. Look, if you remove Adam and Nuh, from Ibrahim downwards, Hud and Saleh on one side, but if you Ibrahim onwards, the vast majority of the prophets are mentioned from the line of the Bani Israel. Israel meaning, not Jews by the way, Israel is a title, Israel is a title for Yaqub, the father of Yusuf. So those who are descendants of Yaqub are known as Bani Israel. But anyhow, so that's the first tradition I wanted to mention. Tradition which is of extreme importance. The fact that it was in these 15 days that Imam Ali came to be known as Amir al-Mu'mineen. So you can imagine, to recap, all of these events are taking place. Eid al-Adha are taking place, right? After that, you have Ayah Wilaya. After that, you have Ayah Tathir. After that, you have Hadith Kisa, Amir al-Mu'mineen becoming Mawla, events of Ghadir, and events of Mubahila. In the words of Zamakhshari, he says, Tafsir Kashaf, the Zamakhshari says that if there was any bigger proof, the biggest proof you could find for the Ahlul Bayt is Mubahila. The biggest proof for Amir al-Mu'mineen, Mubahila. The biggest proof for Imam Hassan Hussein, Mubahila. Why? Because not only are Ahlul Bayt the most, you could say, honest, and all of this plays a part of events that took place afterwards. If somebody comes to the daughter of the Prophet and asks her to produce a proof, I'm Mubahila sufficient enough for people then to take a step back. Why? Because here Allah teaches us the purity of Ahlul Bayt there. And if ever somebody had a doubt as to who the sons of the Prophet are. By sons, what do you mean? On the one hand, the Quran says that the Prophet is no one's father. All he is he's a prophet. Khatamun Nabiyyin, and he's the seal of the prophets. And on the other hand, the verse of the Quran says, wa abna'ana wa abna'akum, wa nisa'ana wa nisa'akum. Bring your sons, we'll bring our sons. And who does the Prophet bring? No, Hassan and Hussein. Although here, in the entire discussion deals in plural. And here, in every respect, the Prophet brings less than plural. It is plural have 3 and more. Here, the Prophet brings less than 3. The greatest of women, the only woman who's of value, if you look at it at the highest level, that Mubahila indicates to us is Fatima alayhi salam. No one's status is any higher than that. And the best of all sons are Hassan and Hussein. But here, the establishment of Imam Ali as the nafs of the Prophet is sufficient enough for you to understand that in these 15 days, what is it? Ayat that here is revealed. That the tahara of Ahlul Bayt, wilaya, take everything to one side. Here Ali becomes the nafs of the Prophet. What is the nafs of the Prophet meaning? Meaning what? We have traditions on this as well, by the way. To say that Ibn Umar once comes, son of Umar, comes, Abdullah bin Umar, comes to the Prophet and he asks, what's so good about Imam Ali? And here the Prophet of God gives a number of fadila of the Imam, the most important of which is that he turns around and he says, well, he's my nafs. He has every single quality characteristic right that I have, but the fact that there's not going to be a Prophet after me. Where do you see this complementary? You see this complementary on the day of Ghadir. Why? Look at the context of it. I remember a Sunni friend of mine messaged me, he says, look, but they were criticizing Imam Ali. They were doubting him, so the Prophet of God then came forward and said, Man kuntu mawla, fa'aliyun mawla. The context of his text was that the Prophet sent Imam Ali to Yemen, they were doubting him. And so for this, he said, Man kuntu mawla. Fine, let's say if that is the case. What is the background to this? 125 narrators have narrated this. The most mutawatir hadith in all of Alam Islam is the hadith of Ghadir. There's nothing more mutawatir than this. So then what does it say? If you look at the Quran's verse, the Prophet reminds them, An-Nabiyyu awla bil mu'minin min anfusihim. Nabi is awla to a person's nafs than they are to themselves. Right? Awla, priority, superiority. If you ask anyone today, what does awlawiyya mean? It means priority. It's awla. So then what does he say? He says, Alastu awla bikum? Am I not superior to you? Do I have superiority to you? As a qalu bala? Yes, you do. No, not yes. Indeed is what bala is. They said na'am. They said qalu bala. Indeed you do. It was at that point the Prophet says, Allah is my Mawla. So remember, Mawla and Awla from the same family. So it's the same root. So if I'm saying that I have more superiority, or I have more friendship over you than you have over yourself, it doesn't make sense. What does make sense is I have more superiority. Then to say Allah is my friend, and whoever's friend, I'm their friend, or whoever's friend, I am Ali's their friend. So it doesn't make sense with the consequence or the sequences of Mubahila, of Ghadir. It was at the point where the Prophet then says, Alastu awla bikum, and then after that, Allah is my Mawla, and I'm the Mawla of the believers. And then he says, فَمَنْ كُنْتَ مَوْلَاهُ فَهَذَا عَلِيٌّ مَوْلَاهُ. That whoever I am Mawla of, Awla of, superior to, Ali is also the superior. Rasulullah is Mawla of the Prophets. Hence people ask, why do Shia say that Ali is Mawla of the Prophets? Well, this is why. Rasulullah is Mawla over his wives, has more rights over his wives. Ali also is the same thing. So therefore, if somebody comes out to fight against Ali or to argue against Ali, they're breaking their allegiance, bearing in mind 3-day festival of Ghadir that takes place. On the first day, the first people to come and swear allegiance are the wives of the Prophet. So, we have much detail, but these 15 days are very important. And look, if you look at it and see, if you look at the Eids that we have, you had Eid al-Fitr, right? Eid al-Fitr is important for what purpose? Eid al-Fitr is a completion of the 30 days. What do? You give fitrah. It's wajib on all of you. Generally, it's on your agricultural produce, let's say, grain, rice, right? So you give 750 grams. And then after this, and it's wajib on all Muslims, and it's a physical form of purification. And then after that, what happens? After that, the next stage comes, right? That you have Eid al-Qurban or Eid al-Adha. What do you do? For the Hajjis, is wajib then, for the completion of their Hajj, to then give a slaughter. And that meat is then distributed to the poor, right? So what is that? In the grand scheme of things, that's your nafs, purification of your nafs now. The first seed is the physical, the second thing is the nafs. But there's something deeper than the nafs as well. And that is the aql and the ruh, qalb of insan. And how is that purified? With the walad ali. And this is why you have ghadir. And this is why it's an obligation. That remember one thing. Ghadir is known as Yawm al-Mithaq as well, the day of the covenant, the day when everyone agreed upon a covenant, or those people who did became followers of Imam Ali alayhi salam. And again, there was free will. Now look, there are, according to some ulama, 12 stages before the stage, one before the other. The one before this is Alam al-Mithaq, right? So Ghadir is important because of that. And then you come on to Mubahila. What is Mubahila that we're here to celebrate today? Mubahila is the success and the absolute success of Ahlul Bayt, the establishment of their wilaya. And remember this, after this now we have no more days really. We only have a couple of days which we're now preparing for the coming of Muharram. Before I go into that though, look, I think it's important just to shed some light, a little bit of light on what Mubahila entails. And then after that, we'll see if we have enough time, we'll go into the next stage. So look, important here to realize is this, that why is it an Eid for us? Look at the context of it. Christians from Najran come to Medina. Now, bear this in mind also, the Najrani Christians are different from certain Christians who were living in the Arab Peninsula at the time. Now, Quran, when it mentions the Nasara, right, the Christians, the Quran, in fact, if you look at it from a historical perspective, is actually looking at two types of Christians. Because there were two types of Christians there in Arabia. This is why it's important now, as I said at the very beginning, to understand other faiths, other traditions, so you know at least who Allah is addressing. The Najrani Christians who came up, they were your modern day type Christians. The ones who after the Nicene Creed and the gathering in Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea, the standardization of Christianity, the Pauline version of Christianity. So your Najranis who were there, they were a satellite state, mainly for the Ethiopians and mainly for Constantinople. There was another type of Christian who was living there as well. So these are those Christians who believed in the Trinity, right? But then somebody who's thinking and who's following me on this can turn around and say, oh, by the way, what about those Christians then in the time of the Prophet before his prophecy? For example, Bahira, when he looks at the Prophet and he says, look, you know, you're going to be a prophet. What kind of a monk was he then? How did he have such knowledge? What about those Christians in Sham, for example, who believed in the one God? What type of Christians were they? Because the Quran, or at least the Hadith, looks at two types of Christians. And even the Quran does, because sometimes you'll see it, it's talking in certain ways that you think, okay, you may get confused that do all Christians believe in the Trinity? To understand this, you've got to understand that there were two types of Christians. Now, just to give you a bit of a background on this, about 70 AD, after the death of Jesus and after that, you had what is known as the destruction of the Second Temple, right? So if you go to Jerusalem, Bayt al-Maqdas, there was a temple there, initially built by Suleiman. That was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar from Iraq. And you had the exile of the Jews that took place. And then after that, there was a return that takes place, and you had the second temple, which was created. that second temple then was demolished, or you could say destroyed, around the 70 AD mark. There's a big difference between the first temple and the second temple. And it is believed by some specialists on temple studies, maybe the top 2 or 3 in the world, is that after the destruction of the first temple, some of the priests, high priests of that temple went to Arabia. And when they put question marks over Islam, they say, well, look, Islam in and of itself was belief in Tawheed, this first temple. Because by the second temple, the belief system has changed from the first temple, right? And I would say that even if it's the case, the first temple symbolizes Abrahamic monotheism, so it really should make a difference to us, even if that accusation is put forward. But the reason why the accusation, or you could say historical fact, becomes even more interesting is because these high priests are the experts of this Abrahamic line who then come into Arabia, and they're exiled there. Now, the argument is that when people look at the Kaaba, there's no doubting that the Kaaba was built by Abraham or somebody like Abraham. In the words of a very prominent Jew, he says, actually, the Kaaba is ours. I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, it was built by Abraham or the high priest. I said, why would you say that? He said, because that the diametrics of the Kaaba is exactly what the Holy of Holy was. Holy of Holy was a particular location inside the temple where you could say Wahi and so forth used to come. And in that used to be what is known as Tabut al-Sakina. And that Tabut al-Sakina would come out and it would float in the air when the Bani Israel went to war. That went missing. It wasn't around in the second temple time, right? But they say anybody who possesses that, there's the power of the creation of the world. Though in my opinion, it is not the physical matter of it, but it is when Insan Kamu possesses it. But look, that's a different story. And that's related to Akhir Zaman, by the way. What I'm telling you now, every single aspect of it is related to Akhir Zaman and what the 12th Imam does. Because remember, the 12th Imam brings forward all of this. So to me and you, it may not make sense because we may not be of that religion, but we are of that family, so it's important to know these things. By the time the second temple is developed and the destruction of the second temple in Jerusalem, before, let's say, or right after the death of Jesus, at least 40, 50, 100 years or so, the predominant school of thought was the Church of Jerusalem. Well, not 100 years, but you could say 50, 60 years, for as long as the Hawariyun of Jesus were alive. And this is why famously there's a person by the name of James, who is regarded as the brother of Jesus within Christianity. Their belief was exactly similar to what the Muslims believe today, that Jesus was a prophet of God, he was the Mashiach. They believed in the fiqh. They believed in the fiqh of the Jews, circumcision and halal or kosher in the language and praying and so forth. In parallel to this, St. Paul was the one who abandoned all law. And this is why in many ways you find that when it comes to our Jewish brothers, they will not, or sisters, they will not pray in a church because they see it as a place of polytheism for 2 reasons. Firstly, because of the Trinity, but secondly, even within our own Shiism, you'll see that part of shirk af'ali is when you do shirk in what is known as the Sharia. So what does that mean? That means that Allah is the only Shari who can legislate. Here what St. Paul does is he abandons it. He mansoukhs the law. And so therefore, in a way that's seen for us, at least, as a form of shirk. But anyhow, that's a technical discussion, which is in theology, it's not relevant here. And again, these type of shirks are, again, batini in terms of outright. But coming back to the point is this, that when so this Church of Jerusalem was then disbanded or destroyed, or you could say finished. But there is record that some of these Christians came to Arabia with the pretext that they were practicing the Jewish religion, obviously. Remember, Christianity wasn't a religion at that stage. It was just a sect of Judaism, right? And Christians were these first level Christians were meant to be very pious. They were meant to be extremely Zahid, Arif, Abid of the Jewish people. So you could say basically like Sunni Islam today is a sect of Islam. Imagine if that broke off and created its own religion. That is basically what Christianity later on became. Well, that is what the Pauline Christianity later on became. At this stage, it was an offshoot. It was just a sect of Judaism. And so all of the Hawariyun of Jesus recognized themselves as Jewish. Anyhow, by the stage that these monks then came to Arabia, they came in the hope of the final prophet because they knew that in Jerusalem they could live. And so this is why when you go back into tradition, you'll always see that the Bible actually mentions, the Quran actually mentions two types of Christians where you've got to see it, catch on to it. And the name that he uses is Nasara as well. It's quite important to understand that. And not always does it address the Christians, but to Nasara either. So anyhow, moving on very swiftly. It was really that Pauline Trinitarian Christianity that the Najranis followed. And so they come to Mecca. They come to Medina. And in Medina, the whole story is in front of you. So I'm not going to go through the story. The technical part was important to mention because perhaps you've not heard of that before. The story is in front of you. It gets to the stage where on this day, there's a Mubahila that takes place. In that Mubahila, Rasulullah brings his family, 5 people. And in that Mubahila, the Khalifas or the chiefs, the Khalifas of the Najranis say, look, if the Prophet brings, or Muhammad brings, his friends, his companions that know that we stand a chance, if he doesn't, then, what do they say? So when they look at these people, they say, look, there's so much nur there, there's so much belief there, there's so much iman there, that these people, if they were to pray, it would damage us, it would annihilate us. So look, in essence, again, why is this important? If you look at even the chain of movement, so the Prophet comes out. If you look at the prison that the Prophet makes when he comes out, he walks in front. He has Imam Hassan walking and Imam Hussein in his arms. 6 months difference, they say, between the 2 brothers. One is walking, one is in the arms, meaning what? He's lifting the line of Imamate. The other one is walking, because technically both of them could have walked. Behind him is Bibi Fatima alayhi salam, hidden, veiled behind the Prophet and his children. And behind them is the nafs of the Prophet. She walks into the step of the Prophet and Imam Ali walks over her step. The hijab and the level of hidden nature of Fatima alayhi salam is worth pondering over. Within this nexus, you could say, is where Ahlul Bayt lies. In there is Fatima, tip is the Prophet, Imam Hassan Hussein. So it goes like this. In and of itself, if you look at the way that that's shaped within the middle, within certain, you could say within Ulum al-Ghariba, that has a big emphasis, there's an influence there. So to bring everything together, because I'm looking at the time, to bring everything together, in essence, these 2 weeks are very important for us because they look at the truthfulness of the Prophet and his family. We're an Abrahamic faith, and just like any Abrahamic faith, succession is always within the family. Ibrahim was succeeded by Ismail and Ishaq, who was then succeeded by their sons. If you look at Yusha bin Nun, Harun, Musa, cousins. In the words of Wilfred Madelon, who was formerly the professor at Oxford University for Oriental Studies once upon a time, in his succession to Muhammad, he says that it just makes sense if that this is an Abrahamic faith. Abrahamic faiths always are succeeded by, they're within the family. There's a nas within the family. And this week's emphasizes that. It looks at the superiority in every regard to Ahlul Bayt. There is no one who's more superior. Ali is the Mawla of the Sahaba. Therefore, Sahaba will always be inferior to Imam Ali. And this is from the root of the Quran. And this is why you notice that there's such a big attack this year in particular. In particular, across your border, attacking Ghadir. Why? Because the minute you shake the grounds of Ghadir, you've pretty much destroyed Islam, the moderation of Islam, the peace of Islam. Why? Because Ghadir symbolizes Ali. And Ali is that person that whatever Imam Ali is found, there's moderation, there's peace, there's tranquility. So this is our culture, this is our religion. This is what we teach our children. This message of Ghadir, which is now coming slowly towards Muharram. On the one hand, celebration of Ahlul Bayt. And then within 5 days, everything goes black. And you have commemoration for Ahlul Bayt, from celebration to commemoration. So on that point, I want to conclude that on this day of Mubahila, which is a very profound day, by the way, for dua. It's a very important day for you to go closer to Allah. Utilize this day. But my takeaway message would be this: read. Read history. Read the Quran. Read history. Read history of other faiths so you can understand your faith better as well. Why is that? Had Allah not addressed Bani Israel 1/6 of the Quran, I would say there's no need. But when there is an address, it means that the people in those days were knowing of it. The people today may not be knowing of it. Mubahila tells us about the victory of Islam, or the victory of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. And this victory was victory of peace. It was a victory where children came and they succeeded. Therefore, there is great power in the family unit. If you take multiple messages away, family should be together. There's great power in the family unit. There's great power in peace. There's great power in our women, in our children, in our men. But more so, there's great power in upholding the line of wilayah. With that, I can only pray to Allah to make us all truly Ahle Wilayah. May Allah forgive our sins and help all of those people who are needy today. Allah hasten the dhuhr of the Imam alayhi salam and make us all part of his ansar. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi at-tahirin.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم كل وليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. سورة المباركة الفاتحة قبل الصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
Going now.